Lord, he whom you love is ill. That is the message that Mary and Martha sent to Jesus. There is not much news that is worse than learning that a loved one is ill. Remember how you feel when you receive such news. The way it seems like time stops when you hear that a friend has cancer. The way your heart skips a beat when you learn that your sibling was in a car accident. The way you can't seem to take a breath when you find out that your parent fell during the night. The cold rush of adrenaline when your spouse wakes you up in the middle of the night and asks you to drive them to the emergency room. Lord, he whom you love is ill. It is safe to assume that these words would have stirred up in Jesus this complicated mix of grief, anger, and hopelessness that each of us feel when we hear such news. But the writer of John does not tell us what Jesus felt. Instead, Jesus says, "This illness does not lead to death. Rather, it is for God's glory, so that the Son of God may be glorified through it." That is not what most of us, any of us, would say when learning that a loved one is sick, injured, or hospitalized. When providing the sick and suffering with care and support, it is important to avoid any suggestion that illness or suffering of any kind is part of God's plan. Suffering is never part of God's plan, not for any of us, not for any reason. But we know that is not what Jesus meant. We know that Lazarus does not die, but that Jesus raises him. And many of the Jews who were there believed in Jesus after seeing this. If we only looked at this story in isolation, Jesus would seem to be saying that by raising Lazarus, it leads to greater glory for God and for Jesus. But let's take a step back and look at the bigger picture. Where does this story of raising Lazarus fit in John's gospel and in the story of Jesus' ministry? We get a few hints in the story. One comes when Jesus decides it is time to return to Judea. The disciples ask, "Rabbi, the Jews were just now trying to stone you, and you are going there again?" And then when they decide to go, Thomas says that they may die with him. What are they talking about? Last week, we heard the story of Jesus giving sight to a man who was born blind. That was in chapter 9. And today we skipped ahead to chapter 11. In chapter 10, Jesus was teaching that he is the good shepherd, and he said, "I and the Father are one." Then his opponents picked up stones to try to kill him for blasphemy, and he fled across the Jordan River to the place where John did his baptizing. It is at some point after this, when Jesus has been staying away from Jerusalem for his own safety, that he hears that Lazarus is ill. Jesus knows that if he goes back to visit Lazarus and to heal him, he will be endangering his own life and that of his disciples. If you were following along in your pew Bibles as we read, you would have also noticed that over these 45 verses are several different subheadings. The very last verse we heard, where many who saw what Jesus did believed in him, is the first verse of a section called "The Plot to Kill Jesus." It is no accident that this story is our gospel reading on this fifth Sunday of Lent. Jesus knows what will come next. As soon as he is told that the one he loves is ill, he knows. He knows he will raise Lazarus. He knows this will inspire many more to believe in him. He knows this will lead to his triumphal entry into Jerusalem on Palm Sunday, to the Last Supper and his arrest, trial, crucifixion, and death. But he also knows that after all of that happens, on the third day, he will rise. Sin, death, and the devil will be defeated. When Jesus says this illness does not lead to death, rather it is for God's glory, so that the Son of God may be glorified through it, he is talking about his own death and resurrection, how God's glory will be shown to the entire world through Jesus' own death on the cross and his own resurrection from the dead. In John's Gospel, raising Lazarus from the dead is the inciting incident for all the events of Holy Week. None of that would happen if Jesus had stayed safe, out of harm's way, on the far side of the Jordan River. Our theme this Lent is No Greater Love. It comes from John 15:13, from some of Jesus' last words to his disciples at the Last Supper. No one has greater love than this, to lay down one's life for one's friends. I wonder if Jesus was thinking about Lazarus when he said that. He loved Lazarus dearly. When his sisters sent Jesus a message that Lazarus is sick, it didn't even include his name. It just says, "Lord, he whom you love is ill." Jesus knew, as soon as he set out to raise Lazarus, that he would be laying down his own life in exchange. But he still went. He still acted out of love, despite the danger, despite the risk, despite an ending to his healing, his teaching, his entire ministry, and his very life. Jesus loved Lazarus, so he went. Earlier in those final words at the Last Supper, Jesus gives his disciples a new commandment, that you love one another. Just as I have loved you, you also should love one another. What does that mean for us today? Jesus loved Lazarus so much that he came back to save him, though it led to his own death on the cross. What are we called to do here, today, in the name of love, that might endanger ourselves, our livelihoods, our very lives? That sounds pretty extreme. For most of us, there isn't much we could do because of love that would be dangerous. Most of us here in Fargo and across the United States are safe to say or do almost anything that our love for one another would call us to do, without fear of consequences. Indeed, the biggest thing that prevents most of us from acting and speaking from a place of love is our own discomfort. How many times have each of us kept silent when love called us to speak, just because we were afraid that what we would say wouldn't sound nice? Just a few moments ago, we confessed that we have sinned against God by the things we have left undone, the times we have not loved our neighbors as ourselves. That includes the times when love called us to speak, but we did not. This Friday, March 31st, is Transgender Day of Visibility, an international day to celebrate the contributions of transgender people and raise awareness about the deadly injustices they face. This past week, Bishop Elizabeth Eaton, the presiding bishop of the ELCA, issued a statement on transgender legislation. My own love for our transgender siblings has called me to share some of that statement with you. Bishop Eaton points out that nearly 400 anti-LGBTQIA+ bills were introduced across the United States in 2022, and that the language in many of these bills attacks the humanity of trans and non-binary people, often erasing the dignity that should be afforded to everyone. The statement concludes by saying, "We may have differing opinions on matters related to sexual orientation and gender identity, but we must always uphold the dignity and humanity of everyone. These disagreements do not allow us to accept actions that dehumanize, discriminate against, or objectify any individual or group. We must stand together, dear Church, faithfully advocating for the full humanity and dignity of all people. Let us recognize and affirm the humanity of our transgender and non-binary siblings. Let us advocate for their dignity. Let us continue to be guided by God's love and compassion as we seek justice and equality for everyone." The entire statement is only 5 paragraphs, but that's the gist of it. When we love our fellow human beings, we do not make laws that oppress or dehumanize them. Bishop Tessa Moon Laseth of our Eastern North Dakota Synod has joined in similar statements and letters to the editor in recent months. As Christians, we are called to love. That is what the Bible tells us. The laws and commandments, the prophets and the Psalms, the letters, and all of the Gospels. Everything in the Bible is telling us to love each other, to love everyone the way that Jesus loved us, and to never stop. To never stop speaking and acting in love. Love for the oppressed, for the hated, for the marginalized. Here and now, in 2023, that means speaking love for our trans and non-binary siblings. Speaking out in love for the trans and non-binary community might not feel dangerous, not a matter of life and death, like it was for Jesus to return to Judea. But it absolutely is. According to the Trevor Project, more than 50% of transgender and non-binary youth seriously considered suicide in 2022. 19% of them actually attempted it. This is an increase over previous years. If we allow hatred and discrimination to continue, more and more trans people will take their own lives. More and more trans people will be the victims of violence and hate crimes. Avoiding our own discomfort is killing our trans and non-binary siblings every single day. When you are full of Christ's love, when you love one another the way Christ loves you, there is no room in your heart for hate, for discrimination, for indifference, for silence. Love calls you to speak up for each other, to protect each other, and to share that love with each other so that hate and fear and silence would be replaced by the glory of God's love, grace, and mercy. Amen.